Good morning, class, or whatever time you're watching this video at. This is lecture 7, Cellular Respiration and Fermentation. So this will be broken into parts because it's kind of just a lot of information. So to start, how is the chemical energy stored in the food we eat used to make ATP, that molecule that drives most cellular work that we learned about in the Introduction to Metabolism last lecture? So think about the big picture of all of this. We're going to focus on some really small picture processes, but in the big picture, like, this is why we need to eat. This is why we need to drink water. This is why we need to breathe, actually. So yeah, think about the big picture. It's because all this stuff helps to give us the nutrients and macromolecules that we can use to get energy in the form of ATP. So in the grand scheme of things, if we zoom out even more, actually, so this lecture we're going to talk about cellular respiration, and next lecture we're going to talk about photosynthesis, but they are tied together really well in the grand scheme of things, because we can only do cellular respiration because plants do photosynthesis. So ultimately, like, if you think about an ecosystem, light is a form of energy, as we talked about. And so the light energy from the sun is used by photosynthetic organisms like plants. And so they use the light and the water that they get to make organic molecules and oxygen. And so they build these bigger molecules through anabolic pathways, building things. And plants breathe out oxygen as like their byproduct. And other organisms like us, we take in the oxygen, we breathe in the oxygen. We eat the organic molecules when we eat the plants. And we use that to do cellular respiration. And so that helps give us energy in the form of ATP. And then we also happen to produce carbon dioxide as a byproduct. And we also make a little bit of water, but that doesn't factor that much into the grand scheme of things. But the carbon dioxide that we breathe out is what plants breathe in for photosynthesis. So it really is tied together. Like, the products of photosynthesis are what are the reactants in the chemical reactions that are in cellular respiration, and then they generate the products of CO2 and H2O, and those are used in photosynthesis. So it's all one big cycle. So yeah, even though they're going to feel like very small scale processes, they tie together really, really well in the grand scheme of things. We help give each other what it takes to survive, really. So organisms that do cellular respiration in their mitochondria get energy from breaking down those molecules. And then plants also have mitochondria still, so they could build their energy and then use it. We can't build it on our own, so we get it from consuming other organisms. So yeah, I think we'll talk about that a little bit more next lecture. So cellular respiration is what we're focusing on today. So plant and animal cells break down organic molecules by cellular respiration in the mitochondria. So yeah, plant cells can make their own molecules through photosynthesis using the help of energy from the sun. And then they can use it because they have mitochondria too. So plant and animal cells break down organic molecules by this process called cellular respiration inside the mitochondria. And so the chemical energy that is in food is then kind of transformed into chemical energy in ATP. So we kind of take that energy and harness it in bonds, right? And that's where we get it from, is from the food. And then a little bit of energy is released to the environment as heat. because we generate, body heat from all of our cells doing this process and losing a little bit of heat. So we don't capture 100% of the energy. A little bit is lost as heat, but we get a good amount. So yeah, energy enters ecosystems as light and then exits an ecosystem as heat. And unfortunately, like that can't be captured, but we do capture a lot of the energy still. So in this whole system, in an ecosystem, the chemical elements that are essential to life are recycled. So photosynthesis uses the carbon dioxide and water that's available to them to make organic molecules and oxygen. And then cellular respiration uses oxygen and organic molecules to make ATP, and then also happens to make carbon dioxide and water as waste. So remember the catabolic versus anabolic pathways. Anabolic pathways, you're building bigger molecules by putting in energy. Catabolic pathways release stored energy by breaking down complex molecules. And so the electron transfer from the food molecules to other molecules plays a big role in these pathways. So that's kind of why we had to learn about chemistry, because it plays a big role in all the processes of life. So this breakdown of organic molecules is an exergonic reaction. It releases free energy. And there are different kinds of pathways. So there is aerobic respiration, anaerobic respiration. I should have bolded that. And then fermentation. Those are the three big catabolic pathways to make energy. So aerobic respiration uses organic molecules and oxygen and makes ATP. Aerobic means with oxygen. So if you think about like aerobic exercise, that's exercise that kind of gets your heart pumping, and so you have to breathe a little bit more. It gets your heart rate pumping, your breathing rate increased. So it's aerobic. So anything aerobic has to do with oxygen. Anaerobic respiration, by adding the an, that means no. So no oxygen. So anaerobic respiration is similar, but at the end of the pathway, instead of oxygen, it uses something else. So this process can be done without oxygen if there's, the stuff in this pathway to use other molecules. So I will come back to this at the end of this lecture. And then lastly is fermentation. So fermentation is a different pathway where it's a partial breakdown of sugars, and that can happen without oxygen too. So there are all kinds of different organisms, and they live in all kinds of different environments. And so some organisms don't have access to oxygen, or maybe not reliably, and so they evolved over time to rely on, other processes that don't necessitate, need oxygen. But for the most part, we are going to focus a lot of time on aerobic respiration. So cellular respiration, we kind of use to mainly talk about aerobic respiration. So, you're eating all kinds of foods, right? Hopefully not just glucose, not just sugar. You're eating a turkey sandwich that has all kinds of other macromolecules too. There's like protein, there's lipids from the cheese, there's all kinds of stuff. So although carbohydrates, fats, and proteins are all consumed as fuel, it's kind of helpful to trace cellular respiration just with this molecule glucose. Because you can, say you're eating pasta, and there's like long chains of complex carbohydrates, but those get broken down into glucose. And then in the pathway, there's all kinds of ways that these other molecules can feed in. But to kind of make things more straightforward and learn about, we just talk about cellular respiration, and we just focus on glucose. That's complex enough as it is. So this overall is the chemical reaction for cellular respiration. Let me see if it's on the next slide. Okay. So overall, this is the chemical reaction. Although it's not exactly just this to this, it's a whole series of steps and reactions. But if you link them all together and think about the big picture, this is the reaction. So glucose is C6H12O6, so it is a little ring. You take glucose and the oxygen we breathe in, we literally have to breathe in to be able to do this process, and that's why we need oxygen. That's why it's called cellular respiration, because we need oxygen for this. Each of your cells needs to take an oxygen to do this pathway and make energy. So for every molecule of glucose, you breathe in some oxygen, and the big picture reaction is that things get, switched around and rearranged in a chemical reaction, and so you make carbon dioxide, water, and then you capture some energy in the form of ATP, and then some is lost as heat. So this is a balanced equation. It's a whole series of reactions, and that at the end, there should be the same amount of carbon molecules, just rearranged and now put into carbon dioxide. And then we happen to make water as well. So we'll talk about all of this, but this is the big picture of cellular respiration. Take glucose and oxygen, and then we happen to make carbon dioxide and water and energy, which is what we really want. And so remember, this is a catabolic reaction because it's releasing energy. It's an exergonic reaction because it's releasing energy. So catabolic pathways don't directly power work in the cell, right? It's not like the energy goes straight to some other process. The energy is captured, again, as I keep saying, in ATP. So we talked about that in the previous lecture. So this is like the portable power bank. So ADP is uncharged. When you take the energy from a catabolic reaction, like cellular respiration, you can hold that energy in ATP. And then that's your power bank that you can use to use that energy for something else. So yeah, catabolic pathways don't directly power work in the cell. They're linked and coupled to other reactions by ATP. And so cells must constantly regenerate their supply of ATP from ADP and phosphate. Yeah. So one more foundational concept that we want to introduce is a certain kind of chemical reaction called redox reactions. Chemistry, I know. I honestly hate redox reactions, but it doesn't have to be too bad, hopefully. So remember that in an atom, there is the nucleus in an atom. It has protons and neutrons, and then outside are electrons. They actually hang out in more of a cloud than a ring, but yeah, just a reminder. So these electrons can be transferred to other atoms. And so the transfer of electrons during these chemical reactions releases the energy stored in organic molecules. And the energy is ultimately used to make ATP. Now, there are chemical reactions that transfer electrons between reactants. So in this reaction, yeah, electrons get captured or get taken from this and put on this. And so we have terms for those reactions. So together we call them redox reactions, but it's two different ones that happen at the same time. So oxidation and reduction. So oxidation is when one atom loses electrons. the loss of electrons from a substance. And it's called oxidation because usually it's like robbed of its electrons by oxygen. If you remember, oxygen is super electronegative, and that's why water is polar. And so oxygen is super electronegative. It like wants to steal electrons. So this process is called oxidation because usually it's oxygen stealing another atom's electrons. So I like to think of it as like, oh, boom, you got oxidized. You got robbed by oxygen. Whatever helps you remember it, right? So oxidation is the loss of electrons from a substance. Reduction, on the other hand, is the other thing. Reduction is when the other thing gains electrons. So it's the addition of electrons to a substance. And this is called reduction because the amount of positive charge is reduced. So this goes from being maybe a neutral thing, or maybe it had a positive charge. And then now, because it has more electrons, the positive charge is reduced. So maybe it was like this molecule NAD+. Now that it has some more electrons, now it's just NADH. And so it is going from positive to negative, or, a little bit more reduced in positive charge. Yeah, so I think the names are not great, but that's science. They name them one way, and then we just all have to deal with it. So oxidation is the loss of electrons from a substance, and reduction is the addition of electrons to a substance. Again, because it's kind of getting more negative. It's reduced in charge. And these, I think, just take hammering and memorizing, unfortunately. So here's an example of sodium chloride. Again, or salt. So sodium, Na, chloride, Cl. So in this reaction, sodium gets oxidized, like its electrons get stolen. It loses its electron. In this case, it's not oxygen, but in reality, a lot of times it is. So this, we say, becomes oxidized because it got robbed of electrons. It loses electrons. And then now, because it lost electrons, it's more positively charged. So it's a Na+. Chloride, in this case, becomes reduced. It gained an electron, and so it goes from neutral to more negative, so its charge got reduced. Yeah. I wish they had a figure that showed the electrons. I think that would help, but, maybe it would help to draw. If this still, has some difficulty clicking for you, maybe try drawing these atoms. So yeah, whatever loses the electron is oxidized. Whatever gains the electron is reduced because now it's more negative. So this is a generic, just generalized redox reaction. It's not, this is in xenon. It's not Xe. X is just kind of like a stand-in for a random atom. The E minus stands for an electron. And then Y is just another random atom. So this is just generic, like a plug-in. So you can imagine anything else there. So if the X atom has an electron and the Y doesn't, but the Y is electronegative and steals the electrons, then the X becomes oxidized and had its electron stolen. And then the Y becomes reduced. And then now it has that electron, and now it's more negatively charged. It's reduced. So this is, just to show a generic redox reaction. And oxidation and reduction always happen together. So if one thing gains an electron, it had to come from somewhere. Something else lost an electron. So that's why we kind of just lump them together, redox reactions, because it's given that they're going to happen at the same time. So some more terms. So whatever donated the electron, we also call that the reducing agent because it reduced the electron acceptor. So it's kind of like the terms are flipped when you say this is this agent. It got oxidized, but we could call that atom the reducing agent because it reduced the electron acceptor. And then the electron acceptor is called the oxidizing agent because it oxidized the electron donor. So the terms are just different based on what you're focusing on. Are you focusing on the reaction? Then we would say this is oxidized and this is reduced. If you're giving a term to like the atom, then this is the reducing agent because it reduced the other thing. And then if you focus on the other atom, this is the oxidizing agent because it oxidized the electron donor. Yeah, I don't know what else to tell you. Okay, so, and then in some cases, instead of fully transferring electrons, some redox reactions change electron sharing in the covalent bonds. So maybe the electrons aren't totally stolen, it just kind of adjusts how they're shared. So yeah, thinking back to that chemistry lecture and how there are nonpolar covalent bonds, things are shared equally. There are also polar covalent bonds where it's not shared equally. And again, it's kind of like toddlers sharing a toy. The toy didn't totally get stolen, but it's really not getting shared equally. One toddler is like, I'll play with it for 5 minutes, and then you could play with it for 1 minute. And so that's how it's like an unequal covalent bond, sharing electrons unequally. So like I mentioned, oxygen atoms are very electronegative. They attract electrons and don't share them equally. They're that like stingy toddler. So the partial gain of electrons by oxygen atoms and then the partial loss of electrons by the bonding partner still makes this a redox reaction. So here is an example of a redox reaction. So burning methane gas. So methane up top and oxygen. And then they also happen to show the bonds below so that they could show the unequal sharing. So methane becomes oxidized because in the reaction, the electrons are not shared equally. Oxygen is kind of hogging the electrons. So they're not just stolen in this case. They're shared, but it's shared unequally. And in this case, it was done by oxygen, right? See what I'm saying? Oxygen. Okay, and then oxygen becomes reduced because it's like hogging the electrons. Now it's a little bit more negatively charged. Yeah, and then that's why water is a polar molecule because the oxygen is hogging the electrons. So this part of the molecule is going to be a little bit more partially negative and then these more partially positive. So yeah, when things are polar covalent bonds, because they're bonded covalently, it's not going to show that in the reaction formula, the chemical reaction. But the molecule itself will have some parts that are polar, so positively charged and then negatively charged partially. They're not totally like ionized. So because methane became oxidized and it technically reduced oxygen, we would call methane the reducing agent. And then oxygen, because it oxidized methane, we call that the oxidizing agent. So again, I kind of just recommend drawing things out and then hammering it out. Yeah. I know redox reactions are very challenging and it just takes work at them. You can get it. Just figure out what works for you. So, an electron loses potential energy when it shifts from a less electronegative atom toward a more electronegative one. And so redox reactions that move electrons closer to the electronegative oxygen atoms release energy. So I say all this not just to give you some random new chemistry thing, right? This is part of biology because cellular respiration is a redox process. So in the big picture, again, it's not just one reaction, but in the big picture of stuff, the fuel molecules that you eat, like glucose, are oxidized. And then the oxygen that you breathe out, or breathe in, sorry, gets reduced. And so it's a whole series of processes and steps, and energy is ultimately released as hydrogen and electrons are transferred to the oxygen atoms. And again, this is just a summary of the whole process of cellular respiration. There's multiple steps. In cellular respiration, glucose, and then other organic molecules. Again, you're eating other stuff, right? But we just track glucose at once. So in cellular respiration, glucose and other organic molecules are oxidized in a series of steps. Each electron technically travels with a proton. So for every electron that you picture moving, also picture a hydrogen atom moving. So an electron also travels with a proton. Yeah, anytime you think of like an electron moving, there's also a proton or hydrogen ion moving. And then together you could kind of think a hydrogen atom. Great chemistry, honestly. So this matters because it's going to come up later on in the process. So we're talking about electrons being transferred, and then later on at the end, you might think like, where did all these protons come from? What? I thought we were tracking electrons. Yes, but electrons travel with a proton too. So it will come up later on, and then I'll point it out, when that happens. So the hydrogen atoms, the electron and the proton, they are usually first passed to electron carriers, not directly to oxygen. So even though ultimately in this like chemical reaction equation, we are saying that it gets transferred to oxygen, it's not a direct reaction. It's not directly passing the hydrogens to oxygen. It's in a series of steps. And that's because if you were to transfer hydrogen and like shove it onto oxygen, it would make an explosive reaction. So if you have seen that movie, The Martian, it's so good. There's this part, this guy, he's an astronaut and he gets stranded on Mars and he has to try to wait and survive the years it takes for somebody to come back and rescue him, right? And so he's like, how am I going to survive that long? I need to grow food and I need water. And so he's like, okay, I can try to make my own water. I have oxygen in the oxygen tanks. I have hydrogen from the fuel, the jet fuel, I don't know, whatever. And so he's like, okay, let me combine them. And then he messes up and then there's an explosion. And so that's kind of just an example of literally if you're trying to force hydrogen and oxygen together to make water, it's an uncontrollable reaction. And you can have a big explosive release of heat and light energy. And we don't want that in our cells, right? So that's why we have to break this up in a whole series of steps. And we have this hugely complicated electron transport chain, but it's for a reason. It's to help manage these controlled reactions, and we don't have, a huge chain of events. Yeah, so this oxidation happens in a series of steps. Yeah, so this is what our bodies do on the right in cellular respiration. We get the hydrogen from food and we breathe in the oxygen. And so technically this reaction's happening, but it's split over a bunch of different little steps in the electron transport chain. We have the electrons kind of play hot potato with a bunch of other molecules until it can safely be like dropped in energy and added to make water. And then in the process, yeah, we're capturing that energy in the form of ATP. It's not that it's our goal to make water for us. The goal is to capture the energy in ATP, and then we just happen to make water. So how do we do that? There is this molecule that is an electron carrier throughout these processes. So there's this molecule called nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, or NAD+. And so that's an electron carrier. It'll carry a couple, one electron for each NADH. And then that can safely be passed along. So as an electron acceptor, NAD+ functions as an oxidizing agent. So it'll oxidize something because it'll take the electrons and then, carry them safely. So NAD+ is the oxidizing agent. When it gets an electron, it gets reduced to NADH because electrons come with a hydrogen atom. Well, they come with a proton, so we kind of just say, NADH. So NAD+ gets reduced because now it's less positively charged and it's neutral. So NAD+ gets reduced to NADH. And then each NADH, again, it's going to feel, hopefully it doesn't, but as we go through the lectures, now hopefully it makes sense when you see that molecule NADH. You can think, okay, it's just holding on to electrons temporarily. So each NADH represents stored energy that will be tapped to make ATP. And so there are these enzymes. So remember, enzymes typically end in ase. So dehydrogenases are enzymes that remove a pair of hydrogen atoms, dehydrogen, from something. So this enzyme is just in charge of taking off electrons and protons from a substance. So then, because it takes off 2 electrons and 2 protons from something, these get transferred to NAD+. So the 2 electrons and 1 proton is transferred to NAD+, forming NADH. And then the other proton is released as a hydrogen ion into the surrounding solution. So again, that's going to come up later. It'll come up later. So that's why you see some hydrogens get slapped onto an NADH, and some will just be in the solution, and then later on, when you see the protons, it'll make sense, hopefully. And again, that's all for a reason. If NADH transferred electrons directly to the oxygen, energy would be released in one explosive reaction. And so instead, cellular respiration breaks the fall of electrons to the oxygen into a bunch of different little energy releasing steps. And then that energy yielded makes us ATP. And then this is just a picture showing what NAD plus looks like. So this is the whole thing. It's actually a modified nucleotide, if you're interested. But so this is NAD plus. And then when it gets reduced because it's gaining electrons, then it's NADH. So there's an electron here, and then a proton and an electron here. So that is an H. I think this is a duplicate. So this is basically what I just said. Yeah, there's a whole electron transport chain. There's a whole electron transport chain that consists of a series of molecules that are built into the membrane of the mitochondria. So in a mitochondria, there is the outer membrane, and then there's the inner membrane that makes a really funky shape, right? So the electron transport chains are in that inner membrane inside the mitochondria in eukaryotes. And then in prokaryotes, which also happen to do this reaction, or if they do, because there's all kinds of prokaryotes. So if this happens in certain prokaryotes, it happens in the plasma membrane, so the cell membrane, because again, prokaryotes don't have membrane-bound organelles inside, so they don't have mitochondria to do this inside of. So the electron transport chain in prokaryotes just happens in the cell membrane. So that molecule NADH passes electrons to this step called the electron transport chain. And those electrons there are transferred in a series of redox reactions, each releasing a small amount of energy. And then in that part, oxygen is the final electron acceptor, and that captures the electrons and the hydrogen nuclei, forming water. So the energy yielded is then used to regenerate ATP. So we're going to get more into the detail of cellular respiration in the next part, but this is a preview so that we can kind of have like a big picture of cellular respiration. So there are 3 stages. Stage 1 is glycolysis. Stage 2 is kind of a combination. Some textbooks separate them out, some lump them together. I kind of like that they lump this one together. But so there is pyruvate oxidation and the citric acid cycle. And so the book, our textbook, is color coding them this way. So glycolysis is going to be in blue. Pyruvate oxidation and the citric acid cycle are going to be in orange. And then the third stage is oxidative phosphorylation. And that actually consists of 2 parts, the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. And so that is going to be shown in purple. So in the next figure, it's going to show these 3 stages and then, those colors. So those are going to be the big picture stages that we'll talk about. So here is glycolysis, stage 1. So glucose gets modified, like broken down into this molecule called pyruvate, and it actually gets broken down into 2 molecules of pyruvate. So that's glycolysis. Glyco, like sugar, and then lysis, break. So you're breaking the glucose apart into pyruvate. Stages 2, pyruvate oxidation and the citric acid cycle. So if you notice, glycolysis is outside of the mitochondria. And it literally is. It happens outside of the mitochondria. This part, glycolysis, happens in the cytosol. So that could happen anywhere in the cell, outside of the mitochondria. But then from this point on, stages 2 and 3 all take part inside the mitochondria. And that's why the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, because the most energy is made inside here. These 2 stages happen in here, and especially the last one, that's where all the big bucks are made of ATP, and that's why mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. It's making the most power inside. So stage 2 is pyruvate oxidation and the citric acid cycle. And then stage 3 is oxidative phosphorylation, which has these 2 parts, electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. And so at each part, some ATP is made. So ATP is made here, here, and here is where the most is made. And so I actually drew a worksheet, this figure as a worksheet, to kind of help you be able to, if you print it out from home, or if you try to redraw it from home, it's basically this figure. And so there are blank spaces so that you can fill in these things. Basically, it's based off of this figure. So you'll fill this stuff in to kind of help you work with the information and remember better. Okay, this happens outside of the mitochondria. This happens inside. This makes some ATP. This makes some ATP. This makes some ATP. And there are boxes here too for the electrons via that molecule NADH. So some electrons get put on to NAD plus here, and then they're carried on forward into this last stage. And then the same here, some electrons are kind of shoved onto NADH and this other molecule that does the same thing, an electron carrier called FADH2. And so they each put in some electrons, and then this is where that gets like powered and the most ATP is made. So there are even spaces for numbers that you could fill in, by the end of the whole lecture. So that's like the preview of cellular respiration, and then a summary of each of those stages. So harvesting energy from glucose by cellular respiration has these 3 stages. Glycolysis breaks down glucose into 2 molecules of pyruvate. In stage 2, pyruvate oxidation and the citric acid cycle, this completes the breakdown of glucose into carbon dioxide. And so this is why we breathe out carbon dioxide, because we make it as a byproduct and our cells can't take too much buildup. So we literally have to breathe out carbon dioxide because all of our cells make it as a byproduct from breaking down glucose. So at this point, glucose is kind of all the way broken down to carbon dioxide, but the electrons are now held and being carried by NADH and that other molecule, FADH2. And then it's during stage 3 that this all comes into play. So during oxidative phosphorylation, the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis facilitate synthesis of most of the cell's ATP. So all of these electrons and protons that travel with them finally come into play, and this is what really drives making ATP. So the process that makes most of the cell's ATP, almost 90% of the ATP, is that last one, oxidative phosphorylation, because it's powered by a bunch of redox reactions. So that's why we covered it so much in the first part, because it'll come into play throughout the cycles, but also especially in oxidative phosphorylation. It's a bunch of redox reactions, and that's what's going to power this machine that is ATP synthase and makes a bunch of ATP. There's a little bit of ATP also formed in glycolysis in the citric acid cycle. It's through this other kind of mechanism called substrate level phosphorylation. And so if substrate sounds familiar, an enzyme has a substrate, right? So substrate level phosphorylation occurs when an enzyme transfers a phosphate group from a substrate to ADP, and that's how it's making some ATP. So some ATP is made in glycolysis and the citric acid cycle this way, but the most is made at the end by oxidative phosphorylation. And so that happens a different way that we'll talk about when we get to that stage. So here's just kind of a picture. There's an enzyme. It'll take a substrate and then slap a phosphate group onto ADP, making ATP. So that's how some ATP is made in glycolysis and the citric acid cycle. But at the end, when we do oxidative phosphorylation, that's a different mechanism. And yeah, we'll talk about that when we get there in part 2. And so I think this analogy is kind of funny. This is an analogy for the energy that you get through glucose. So glucose has a lot of energy, especially because of all the hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds are where it's at. That's where energy is. And so glucose has a lot of hydrogens that you can yank off and then capture the energy. And it's a lot of energy, but in a glucose molecule, it's kind of harder to get. And so we want to get the energy and put it to smaller molecules of ATP. So an analogy is money for cellular respiration. So glucose is like $100 bill. Like when you have $100 bill, you're like, whoa, I have $100. It's worth a lot, but you might have a hard time spending it anywhere because people are like, oh, I don't have change for that, or I don't even think it's real, you know. They will have to do a pen, and it depends on if they have enough change in the register to be able to do that, because then they need to have change, right? Anyway, so glucose is like $100 bill. It's worth a lot, $100, but it's harder to spend. But ATP is like having 100 $1 bills. And then it's super easy to spend that, right? Like if you have to spend, you already have it broken down into like easy denominations. Yeah, it's a lot easier to spend. So ATP is like having 100 $1 bills. It's technically worth the same, this stack of $100 versus that $100 bill, but it's easier to access and use. And so, yeah, that's like an analogy for the energy that comes from glucose. We want to break it up and store it into these smaller molecules of ATP. That is a lot easier to use. So cellular respiration caches in a large amount of energy in glucose for the small change of many molecules of ATP. And so for each molecule of glucose, you make 32 molecules of ATP. Well, up to. There's a little bit of variation that we'll talk about, but you can make up to 32 molecules of ATP. So instead of like a $32 bill, who's going to take that? You have 32 single dollars. This is kind of saying the same thing. So for each molecule of glucose that ends up getting shuffled around and remade into carbon dioxide and water, you can make up to 32 molecules of ATP. And so that is a preview of cellular respiration. And in the next lecture, part 2, we will get more into the detail of how this works.